Angus can be the brave.
You can also switch on my thing if you like.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know. Yeah. You can keep that one throwing around. Yeah, for sure. First of all, thank you very much for all your lovely talks. I've had a wonderful time. People in the chat have also been having a wonderful time, as I was able to see. What struck me is that, especially with the two first presentations, there are so the histories that you're trying to put there are so very deeply personal. Yet, I was wondering are there any sort of, except for making these things deeply personal, which is of course a great go-to, or maybe not even personal, but specific. Are there any general design, development practices that you can say, so, this is not a game about my personal history, or this is not a game about this period of history in America, that you can transport if you're interested in doing any other historical games? How do you make these things personal?
Hello. I think one of the key things that certainly you've done is you get experts from those fields and you work with them and you pay them.
That's nice. Yeah.
You find people who either are from those cultures or are a specialist in those cultures, and you work with them, you get them involved in your team, and if it's all possible within your budget, you actually pay them for their work as well. I think that's a very important part of that.
Yeah, that's definitely number one. Number two is also doing your own research and trying to understand the subject from as many perspectives as possible. I think that even non-historical games do this. You hear a lot of game companies talk about like their lore Bibles or whatever, where somewhere someone has a document that talks about the 50,000 years of dragons killing whatever, in their video game, and they don't give that to the player, but they know that it's there and they can reference it at all times. And I think it's similar for a historical video game is all of that stuff, even if you don't shove it all into your video game.
All right, thanks.
More questions? Yes.
Hey, I was wondering what your thoughts are about the construction of space and place regarding to music, because I think that music plays a really important role, and I was curious to hear your thoughts about it.
I'm completely unqualified to answer the question, but I will answer personally. I think that the music is a great way to convey, not necessarily information, but convey something that you cannot do necessarily through narrative means, or it has an emotional, it can convey emotional information, or if there's something like that. For League of Legends, I know that all of our champions have specific themes, and even though I'm viewing this completely from the outside, I'm just absorbing what the music team has created, I'm amazed how they can describe characters with instrumental music. The same applies. There's also themes and music for places and nations in Runeterra, and it's always fascinating to see the behind the scenes on how they work and how they try to create an audio like landscape just from that. And yeah, it's super interesting. I think it's a very important piece of games.
Maybe Johnman can also fill in about that, because Where Water Tastes Like Wine has an amazing soundtrack, and also really adjustable on the different places you go, the music changes.
Yeah, that's right. So we actually, because the game is inspired largely by American folk culture, which includes folk music, each character also has their own sort of musical theme that comes in. Like the beat poet that you saw has a jazzy theme, the miners use Appalachian bluegrass, all that sort of stuff. And then, as you said, as you wander the United States, we use one song for the overworld, but it actually changes what kind of song it is, depending on where you are in the United States, to kind of reflect the musical heritage of that area. And yeah, that's very important to us from a cultural standpoint, you know, to have people singing in Spanish when you're in the southern United States and so on and so forth. Just that, bringing in that extra bit of background, which really helps tie the audience to the characters, I hope, I think.
Great.
Yes.
Another question.
There's an interesting little sort of sub-point there of talking to your audience in a language that they'll understand as well. Not necessarily just about the language, but obviously about musical language. There are differences in how music is composed around the world. For example, and also there's ideas about kind of how culture is stereotyped too. So if you go to China in a video game, you're going to have flutes. You're going to kind of stuff going and mountains and mist and stuff like that. And it's like, this is a stereotype of how China sounds to a Western person. Does China sound like that to people from China? I'd want to find out. But you also might find that historical periods of Chinese music sound discordant to a Western ear. Perhaps. I don't know. I'm just using China as an example. I would want to do research before I said this was true. But using it as an example there. But that's my point. I don't know, but I suspect there are parts of history which would disengage a player. And then you get the difference between something that I think we've all tackled a little bit in our own ways, between what we know is true about the culture or the lore or the creation of the game, and what an audience is willing to accept as part of an entertainment experience. And so trying to get this border between historical accuracy and entertainment product with a commercial interest is always interesting. It's a challenging one. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentations. It was really great. I have a question for when the water tastes like wine. Please. It's just that we are living in political turbulent times, so I was wondering whether you have or receive what kind of messages from the political tones you have in your game and how you decided to deal with that.
Yes, so very much so. Like as I said in the presentation, it's intended to be a work of art that kind of holds up a mirror to the United States. The interesting thing is that I started this game in 2014 and had all the same things to say back then as now, but the world has sort of maybe underlined them a little bit more now. But one of the big themes of the game is that the United States specifically, and in my view, the whole world has maybe been wrestling with a lot of the same problems that we're facing right now in different ways. There's a poem that I used as inspiration. There's a whole lot of poems that I used as inspiration for the game, but one of them is by Langston Hughes from the 1920s, and it's got this line in it, "America was never America to me," where he talks about being a black man in the United States and the promises of this land of freedom and wonder that, in his view, were never fulfilled. And I think that you could read that poem today, 100 years after it was written, and still feel many of the sentiments were true from a black person's perspective. So, yes, basically a lot of the characters were chosen, a lot of the themes were chosen specifically to kind of question specifically the United States values and whether we're actually living up to those, and just kind of ask ourselves who we are and who we want to be.
Yeah.
Oh, you go, Greg.
No, there are a couple of questions from the chat. So
I was going to ask you a couple of questions.
but yeah, go ahead.
I find it interesting also what you're saying there about sort of black representation in these things. And we may notice that in games culture and games conferences, there's usually a lack of people of colour and black people specifically. And I think that's worth highlighting, as we have 4 male presenting people who are white standing on stage. I thought that was worth highlighting for a moment, and I hope we have more people later on. Do we have women speaking later, I hope?
I don't. Sure.
Let's hope that happens. And that will definitely be for the third conference. Let's make sure that happens. Cool. But actually, I wanted to ask, in terms of representation of kind of historical periods, the Medicis, this is empire, this is power. You talk about 20th century, and we're talking about world wars. Do you find other games that were better or an interesting games which were talking about things that are perhaps more of the everyday of culture in history?
The games that were that came out during the survey and doing the research were about actually some kind of long period of time, and most of them treated history sometimes more like an history books, or where you can say something like Age of Empire. Like say you have the main nations fighting for the power and taking the power over some regions of the world in that period of time. There is by now a small space for that kind of video game that talks about the everyday life about in history, you can say, because also something that could be interesting is how did they live? What was the life back then? It's not something that you usually see in video games, like I already say that in Age of Empires games, Assassin's Creed games, or God of War games. It's more like some fantasy about the past than actually everyday life in the past. So it's not something that we can see now, but it's probably something we have to see to actually communicate history through video games.
And a couple of questions from the chat. They are quite similar, so I'm gonna bind them together and we can sort of wrap up the session with this, because I think both of them deal with the overarching theme. So Teistenhauer and Balthuk both are asking more or less how do you think history or mythology or historical and mythological themes can be integrated in video games in a way that doesn't just make them only the setting. So whether a developer can not just, especially in terms of AAA games, not just have a very big successful game like Assassin's Creed and then just paint over it whatever historical theme they want, but then start from the other way around, actually having the theme in mind and then try to make a game out of the theme. And I would like all your opinions, starting from Jack.
I can start with yours.
Yeah.
The microphone. So, well, I think this is a game design question, because if you want to communicate history or mythological history or everyday life history through a game and not using history just like a setting, you have to work hard on the game design of the games, because it is easy to use history as a setting, because you just have to build the world and throw your game already done in it and just let the game play by itself. Different is implement history in the game design, and that should be the focus and the objective we have to use to communicate history, mythological history, and, as I said, everyday life using games.
I'm really interested in especially in the mythological side of the question, where I think that what is not as much explored as I would like, so completely personal opinion, is that so myths are, and mythology, I think, are the expressions of something deeper. They're the expression of stories and themes and questions that that humanity has been struggling with since we started being humans. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the Lernaean Hydra and all these. This is just, I think, how people were expressing those undercurrents, those, whatever is underneath the myths. And this is something that I would like to see used more, not how myths are expressed through the ages, which is interesting as well, but I think it's a bit overplayed. It's more about what did the people who came up with those myths wanted to express. That's something I find very interesting.
For me, I think we've got some challenges in terms of gameplay verbs. So what can players do? We've got these game engines, and is anybody here working on a game at the moment? Who's making a game currently? Not many of us. Okay, who's using Unity? That's mostly the same people. Who's using Unreal 4? Okay, that's pretty much everybody else. Is anybody using Twine or Ink? Okay, and that's the last one. Yeah, okay, yeah. So we've got basically a restriction of 2 engines set up for 3D interaction and 1 engine set up for text. Obviously, text has got a very long history in terms of what it can do in the many places it can take people. Game engines are typically set up for walking around a 3D environment and clicking on stuff. And it lends itself very easily to the metaphor that has been developed many times, which is destroying stuff. Because destroying stuff is easier to do than building stuff, because it takes less physics calculations. And that's the problem, I think, that we've got the engines that are built around physics calculations and tech problems, rather than natural gameplay verbs of cooperate, share, communicate, play, explore, unravel, unfurl. You know, there's so many ways of talking about revelation in our lives, revealing what is hidden inside ourselves and the worlds around us, that are not good gameplay verbs yet. And so I think we are restricted by the engines that we have and how we use them. One way of counteracting this is to get narrative designers involved right at the very start of this, historians involved right at the very start of the game's development process, and go, our tech focus for this game is to make this gameplay verb work and be fun and rewarding, just like smashing vases is. If we can make revealing as fun as smashing a vase, then I think we have whole new worlds of games that are going to be unraveled before us. But I don't think we're quite there yet, but I would like to see somebody try it. Unfortunately, programming new features is expensive. So if you want to pay us to do that, please do.
I'd actually like to riff on that a little bit too. I don't think it's entirely the fault of the engines. I think there's also we need to build audiences that there are a couple ways we could go. We need to build audiences that will appreciate those modes of gameplay, which absolutely need to exist. And I think, though, that if you approached an Ubisoft or a 2K or something like that, and even if you said we can make this fun, they may not be convinced that they can sell that to an audience, because that's difficult. So we need to build audiences that will appreciate that, or we need to find different ways of funding games such that they don't need huge audiences to appreciate them to afford to be made, and I think that would be excellent. And then just to circle back to an earlier point, I wanted to say that where the Water Tastes Like Wine was not actually originally built to be a game about the Great Depression, I took the things that I wanted to say and the sort of ideas that I wanted to have about traveling and telling stories and this sort of fantastical world, and I looked at what game genres and what time periods might fit that best, and I chose the Great Depression because it sort of reflected a lot of things that were happening in the U.S. Right now, and also, you know, it's sort of this romantic period in many people's minds of, you know, hopping on a train and going wherever you want to go, living with just a bundle over your back, and you know, that kind of extreme freedom that, at least in the U.S., we mythologize a lot. So, yeah.
Well, I would like to wrap up this session now. A round of applause for our speakers and their extremely interesting presentations. Thank you very much.